Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to class number 5 in this series from Bodhi Tree Buddhism, where we're reading the modern classic The Way to Buddhahood, 成佛之道 by Venerable Master Yin Shun. We're continuing on today with the content regarding taking refuge in the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma and Saṅgha. And we've got two verses that we're going to be looking at today, which concern taking refuge in the jewel of the Saṅgha. Now, let's look at the text. I'm just noting there might be some issues with the stream here. I hope all goes well. Okay, so into the text. Now, as usual, we're just going to read through the Chinese and then on to the English translation. So, 依法以摄生和乐境为本，是合或离合，离生众众尊。 Relying on the Dharma to bring together the Saṅgha, which has harmony, happiness and purity for its foundation, harmony in practice and harmony in principle, homage to the Saṅgha, foremost of assemblies. So we've got a couple of key points here. The first one, of course, the idea that the very Saṅgha itself is brought together by the Dharma. It's kind of interesting when you look at the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma and Saṅgha. I mean, there's different ways to present them, but often, you know, what it sort of boils down to is it's the Dharma that ends up kind of being as the core. Usually ideas like, you know, the Buddha is the Buddha because he's realized the Dharma, and the Buddha teaches the Dharma. And of course, the Saṅgha is the community that's also practicing the Dharma. So sometimes you'll kind of reduce down to this similar kind of principle. The second bit here, which is harmony, happiness and purity for its foundation. So these are just kind of some general principles. In a way, we can look at the Saṅgha as sort of like ideally, the sort of like idealized community. I mean, the word Saṅgha itself just basically means like a community or a gathering. You could say congregation if you like, so a bringing together, which is what the English word congregation means. And there's a couple of principles here. So obviously harmony, it should be a community where all the members and the participants in that community come together in harmony without conflict. Happiness, of course, not just the way that which we form our societies, you know, for the goal of happiness, but as the Dharma is the practice to the end of suffering, or the end of dukkha or dissatisfaction, of course it's also got the goal of happiness, not just in the short-term sense, but also a goal of happiness in the ultimate sense. In purity, with again sort of similar principle, you know, purity of afflictions, purity of our actions and so forth is what actually brings about that happiness. So it's pretty straightforward stuff, right? It's a bit abstract. The third line there, so harmony in practice and harmony in principle. So particularly in the Chinese community, they'll talk about the Saṅgha, Chinese term is 六合境. So it's three harmonies respect, and six harmonies respect, and there's these six sort of basic principles around which the Saṅgha is based. And so they are in turn. So the first one is harmony in terms of view. The second one's harmony in terms of precepts, in terms of like the monastic discipline codes. Then we have harmony in terms of body, speech and mind, which are the three karmas. And then the last one is harmony in terms of benefit, you could say. So just quickly running through those, which are then included within this notion of harmony in practice and in principle. So the first one is harmony in terms of view. You know, the whole idea of harmony means that the Saṅgha community has, you know, commonality in terms of their view. They have the same basic view. Now, of course, this view is, you know, the view of the Dharma, you know, the basic principles of the Buddha's teachings. And we can even draw that right back to, you know, a particular actual historical event. So obviously the Buddha's spending his life, he's teaching the Dharma to the community and to his disciples. But fairly late in the Buddha's teaching career, another very important event was happening outside of Buddhism, which was the death of the founder of Jainism, so often known as Mahāyāna, at the time known as Nagantanatta Buddha. So he passed away. So he had a huge, big religious community as well, and very unfortunately, the Jaina community really immediately fell into conflict. There was huge disagreement about what constituted the teachings of Mahāyāna. That's pretty awkward when a religious leader set up this large community, and as soon as that person is no longer there to sort of arbitrate and say, well, yep, I said this and I didn't say that, or this is what I meant and I didn't mean that, there's this kind of conflict in the community. And so the Buddhists, watching this from the side, because it was happening, they were right in the same places, in the same cities, associating with the same people. They're like, well, we've got to avoid that same problem too. And you had disciples of the Buddha like Sariputra. We gathered together the community, and they would kind of make sure, okay, everyone's on the same page, right? Here are basic principles, keep them in mind. And we saw it also after the Buddha passed away with the first convocation led by Mahākasyapa, right? So where the large group of the Buddha's liberated disciples gathered together, they recited the teachings of the Buddha as memorized by Ananda, and the discipline is memorized by Upali, and they say, like, do we all agree on this? Do we all agree that this is what the Buddha said? And everyone's like, yep. Okay, so confirmed. And so this, these are some of the historical events that bring up this first of these 6 principles of harmony, so harmony in terms of view. And it's quite important, a group that has a similar sort of world view. What are our basic underlying principles? And that can be a very powerful sort of ideological underlying factor for maintaining that harmony. The second one is, so what's the first one? Body. The second one is harmony in terms of precepts. And again, this, these precepts were established during the Buddha's time, and even when the Buddha passed away, there was a little bit of discussion about, well, it wasn't really discussion, a bit of history again. So as the Buddha was about to enter parinirvana, Ananda comes along and he asks, some questions. Well, what are we going to do after you pass away, you enter parinirvana? The Buddha said, well, you can actually remove some of the minor precepts, but in this convocation after the Buddha's passing, Ananda goes, Mahākasyapa, the Buddha said we can remove some of the minor precepts. And Mahākasyapa, as the sort of the senior disciple, says, well, what are these minor precepts? And Ananda was like, oh, well, I didn't ask exactly what that was. And Mahākasyapa goes, no, then we don't remove any of them. Now, you could argue it's a little bit arbitrary for Mahākasyapa, but it did mean at the time, yep, okay, well, that's how it is, and that convocation agreed that they basically all stay in place. So again, there's this commonality in terms of their ethical codes of behavior. I mean, if you look at even like professional organizations, you want to be a doctor, you want to be a lawyer, you want to be an accountant, these professional bodies all have their own rules that you sort of have to follow in order to be sort of a member in good stead, or otherwise, practice of discipline. And this maintains in a harmony rather than just a bunch of people claiming to be doctors or lawyers and they got like no credentials or they have no ethical standards. So it's a similar principle as well. I mean, it's a very good idea for harmony of a community or a social body. I mean, you can think about it, even when we make clubs or societies these days, we also have rules. If you want to be a member, here are the rules you got to follow, etc., etc. Then the next 3, so a body, speech, and mind. So harmony in body, speech, and mind. Of course, these are all based on the principles of the practice of the Dharma. You've got basic ethics from, say, the 5 precepts. Harmony of not harming or taking life, not stealing, etc., etc. Speech, right speech, no false speech, or etc., etc. And again, in terms of attitudes of the mind, so avoid of negative states, craving, aversion, desire, jealousy, pride, etc., etc. So these are basic principles that the Saṅgha as a whole can agree on. And then the last one, which is harmony in terms of benefits. Benefit, what does that mean? Well, it just basically means that the benefits that are accrued to the Saṅgha, so offerings to the Saṅgha, donations to the Saṅgha, are shared among the Saṅgha equally And this is also, I think, a really important idea, and kind of interesting that this could be applied elsewhere in society. So if you take, for example, like even a largish monastery, so some of these big religious communities have got leaders who are, very well known, they are famous, they are honoured. You can have all sorts of, devotees and kind of their fan base. And, these people, wow, I'm going to write a $500,000 donation to the monastery or to the person. Now, when these donations go in, they're often, not always, often inspired by the sort of the big names, the big A-listers within the Buddhist, monastic community or the Buddhist leadership. Now if they took that money and kept it for themselves, I mean, obviously if it's money, there's issues with members of the Saṅgha keeping money anyway, but if they just use it for their own benefit, you're going to get this really bad issue in the community, because then junior people, other people in other roles, are going to get very little benefit, and the Saṅgha, they are relying on benefits and donations. So the principle is that rather than accepting donations as like something personal, donations are made and benefits of all forms are made to the Saṅgha, and they should be evenly distributed throughout the Saṅgha, at least to a fair degree. Now, obviously, if someone's going on like begging around with your alms bowl, they don't all then take all their alms bowls and like pour it out together and like divvy it up into even amount. I mean, okay, you got your food in your bowl, and this person's got their food in their bowl. People should give that food equally. But in other situations, where benefits come to the Saṅgha, they should be distributed for the benefit of the Saṅgha as a whole and evenly. Now, I say this might have some implications elsewhere, because we can see in other areas of society where things not being fairly distributed cause all sorts of social issues. Just something as simple as food. There's enough food in the world to feed everyone. It's not the amount of food that's the problem, it's the distribution of food. We can say the same thing for other things as well. There's enough water, but it's not distributed to the right places. Wealth and other things. So and this unequal distribution of wealth does often lead to social conflict. And the Buddha himself has talked about this as well, and the same for other principles too. Okay, so these are then the six forms of harmony that constitute the Saṅgha. And this kind of idea of these six forms of harmony, it's very strong in the Chinese traditions. You don't really see it so much in the other traditions, as far as I'm aware. But I think it's some really interesting principles. A bit abstract, but it gives these like really important like guidelines for creating a harmonious a community that upholds these principles. It's founded on the Dharma. It comes together in harmony for mutual benefit, individual and mutual benefit. It's looking to purify itself and to bring about happiness as a result. That is the foremost assembly, or that is the best kind of community that you could have. Okay, let's jump into the second of the verses here. Okay, so just playing around here. Okay. 净身莫合身，亦莫衡量身。随佛修行者，住持正法正。This should be xing and not hung. It's what happens when you use the automatic, pin-in function in Word. One should respect the Saṅgha and not deride the Saṅgha, nor judge and weigh the Saṅgha. Those who follow the Buddha in cultivation and practice abide in and maintain the city of the true Dharma. Okay, so we've got a couple of ones that start. I mean, the first one is just simply, respect the Saṅgha, look towards the people that make up the Saṅgha, and remember, the Saṅgha doesn't mean this should really be added, I think, in this part of the text. What is even meant by Saṅgha in the first place? Often we think of Saṅgha as the monastic community. That is one definition of Saṅgha, certainly, but strictly speaking, I mean, Okay, there's different levels you can look at it, but basically any Buddhist is a member of the Saṅgha. It doesn't matter if one is lay or ordained monastic, male, female, young or old. The Buddhist community is the Saṅgha. But it can be broken up into different ways. So you can have the monastic Saṅgha, lay Saṅgha. It can be broken up into like the Saṅgha of monks, so the community of monks, the community of nuns, lay men, lay women. You can add in novice monks, novice nuns, and you can also add in the so-called probationer. It's not the best word there. The trainee section for the novice nuns as well. That's the way of talking about it, like in terms of one's social position, so gender and social status, lay and monastic. And then another very important way to talk about the Saṅgha is to talk about it in terms of spiritual attainment. Of course, the difficulty with that is we don't usually know exactly what people's spiritual attainments are. We don't walk around going to the temple with a little badge, 3 mantra, 3rd level bodhisattva. We don't do that, and we shouldn't do that. People are of different levels of development, obviously, but we don't know that. So using like social things is very obvious. Monastic, layperson, we take a social basis to then sort of assign where people are and what their roles are within the Saṅgha. And I just want to sort of add this. The text should really put this in, to be honest. The different types of ways of looking at the Saṅgha. Anyway, one should respect the Saṅgha. So having respect for the Saṅgha is important. This is a community of spiritual practitioners, and not deride the Saṅgha. Now, I think these 2 lines are probably thinking of the Saṅgha in terms of the monastic community. So particularly as lay people, to have respect for the Saṅghas is very important, and not deride, or you could almost translate that as like criticize. Now, I just want to say something about this, because I think, okay, so in principle, yes, correct. In recent decades, the issue of religious communities abusing that power that they have, it's a big issue, and we've seen it in many places, and it's really terrible. We're doing this in English. And so people watching this probably more familiar with, say, issues that have happened in the Catholic Church, and some of those problems, justice needs to be enacted. Now, it's not to say that Buddhists are pure in this regard and there haven't been any issues. So we have to be careful here, because it's easy then for people, say within the Saṅgha, when they do actions which are really dodgy, to turn around and say, oh, you shouldn't criticize the Saṅgha. And there's this principle that is found within Buddhist cultures. In Chinese, it's called 生事生觉, which means matters of the Saṅgha are resolved by the Saṅgha. And I believe in Myanmar, and it might be the case also in Thailand, that basically the Saṅgha has its own kind of legal system. So they can't go and like arrest a monk, but the Saṅgha itself must deal with those. Now, if it was the case, and when it's the case, that the Saṅgha is properly enforcing its own principles and its own policies, and if any abuse is taking place, then it is dealt with, then I think that's fine. Then, they can sort of say, the matters of the Saṅgha will be dealt with by the Saṅgha. But if there's a situation where they're not, and people are abusing that position and abusing that status, then that is, I'm just going to say, that's wrong. And if the lay community then, for whatever reason, puts pressure on the Saṅgha to deal with corruption or the like, well, so be it. The Saṅgha can't take itself as entirely outside of society. There is still a dependent relationship then, and the responsibility is to maintain that kind of ethical purity. So this for the first one, that's a judge, and particularly that second one, not deride or not criticize the Saṅgha. There's also the third line though, not judge and weigh the Saṅgha, is more in the sort of situation whereby it's easy to be a layperson these days and know quite a bit about what the actual basic rules and guidelines are for the Saṅgha. So it used to be in ancient times, before these texts were written down, that lay people wouldn't know what the monastic rules are, because they would be recited by the monastics, and it's a private environment in which that takes place, not public. Nowadays, of course, all these things get written down. Some Buddhist communities still have the basic principle that laity shouldn't study the Vinaya. So, for example, if you go to the City of 10,000 Buddhas, if you know, in their libraries, so the Vinaya are kept in a separate section for the monastics only. And the principle being then that these are rules for the monastic community, so they can study it. It's not for the lay community. And it's avoiding a situation whereby it's very easy for lay people to sort of read up all these rules of the Saṅgha and then take those to judge and weigh up Saṅgha members. You know, he's about, oh, look at that monk. Oh, look, he's doing that. He's breaking the rules. And then look at that nun over there. See what she did? That's against rule number 28, 28 subsection B5. It's very easy to be critical. Now, you can say, well, what's wrong with that? Again, as I said, you know, it's... Well, I didn't say this. I've said this elsewhere. I haven't said it in these sessions. To see a bunch of rules and to use those principles to then criticize whether others are following or not following the rules is not the point of the precepts. The precepts are training precepts. So they are things that members of the Saṅgha say, well, I want to train in these things. It doesn't mean that, like, as soon as you take the precepts, you can just say, from now on, I will absolutely never do this. It's like, when you say that, you're saying an aspiration. I hope to never break these rules. This is what I plan to do. But like anything, you're training yourself in it. It's like when you start to learn to ride a bike. I mean, your principle is not to fall off the bike, but, you know, as a kid, falling off your bike, you do all the time, right? Your skinned knees and skinned elbows, you know, smashed in my teeth falling off my bike onto the road. We don't look at a kid riding a bike and falling off a bike and scold them. Like, oh, you broke the rules of riding a bike, right? So what? No, the kid's riding a bike. They fell off the bike, you know, because they're not good enough at it yet. It's, you know, it's really easy when you're not following the precepts to criticize others who might break them, and there's quite a bit of hypocrisy in that, isn't there? If you kind of think about it, and, you know, just work on your own practice. There are other well-trained members of the Saṅgha community that will look after monastics that don't follow the precepts properly. Leave it up to them. Leave it up to people who themselves can do it. It's not our role as lay people who don't follow those at all to then be critical of others. Now, that, again, it doesn't mean that if, say, that action is actually, you know, creating you know, problems for lay people, for example. It doesn't then mean, you know, like abuse, for example. You shouldn't say anything about it, you know, don't judge in a way. Obviously that's an issue that must be brought up and it must be resolved. It's more for that situation of sort of like, I know these rules, I never follow these rules, but I know they're supposed to follow these rules, and I'm going to criticize them when they don't do it properly. That doesn't really help anyone at all. Okay, we've got the last two lines here. Those who follow the Buddha in cultivation and practice. So this is referring to the Saṅgha, and we can again talk about this in broad terms or narrow terms. We can talk about Buddhists in general. We follow the Buddha in our cultivation and practice, or we could say more narrowly, it's the Saṅgha community as monastics, who obviously their cultivation and their practice is much more closer to the Buddha. These people, the Saṅgha, members of the Saṅgha, abide in and maintain the city of the true Dharma. So again, we get back to the story that we had last week, right? Finding, you know, the person in the wilderness, and they find this ancient path. They follow the ancient path and find an abandoned city. They realize that many people could live in that city. The infrastructure is still in place. They go back to their little, you know, peasant village in the mud and sticks and caves or something. Bring all the people along that same path, and they rebuild this, you know, glorious city. And that's what we're doing. So long as we're following the Buddha, we're following his guidance for our practice, then we are also abiding in and maintaining that city as well, and keeping that city alive and vibrant and accessible to others. And that's also an important, you know, role. Although the Dharma is the truth that can be realized anywhere and at any time, for most of us, when it's not going to happen, most of us aren't Buddhas or Pratika Buddhas. Most of us need someone else to demonstrate that to us and point that out to us. And that's what that's a really important role of the Saṅgha, is to provide that environment and that place where others can come into contact with the Dharma and learn about it. So again, that ties through then the Saṅgha with the Dharma, and we can see, you know, Buddha, the founder, discoverer of that city. The Dharma is that ancient city and the path to that city itself. And then the Saṅgha, the people who, you know, travel along that path, and they're going to maintain that path. They're going to clear it up, make sure it's even more clear and obvious to others to follow. They're going to tidy up that city, keep it maintained, keep it in good shape, so that if at some point it is lost, the next generation to find it will be able to find it more easily, and again, more easily able to bring it back into the sort of resplendent and glorious city of the true Dharma. Okay, that's about it for today. Next week we're going to be talking a little bit about the three jewels in enlightenment principle and practice, and this is a bit like when we're saying, say, the Buddha as, you know, we think of Shakyamuni Buddha, this person who lived in this time and this place, versus the Buddha as in the more abstract sense. Likewise, the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, versus the Dharma as the truth, and the Saṅgha as sort of a community of Buddhist practitioners versus the actual spiritual attainments that the practice of the Dharma can lead to. And so, you know, again, when we're taking refuge, it includes these different aspects, and it's important to kind of clarify the differences there. So in different cases, when we're talking about taking refuge, or we're talking about Buddha, Dharma and Saṅgha, which of those are we talking about exactly? Okay, thanks everyone for joining me. I hope the live stream has worked. If not, I'll just be uploading this as a video anyway, and it'll just be a little bit later than usual. Okay, thanks everyone. Take care, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.